The auction house smelled like old velvet and fear, and Willa Bennett stood on a platform under lights so bright she couldn't see the faces bidding on her. She'd known it would come to this eventually. 3 months ago, she'd been fired from the diner where she'd worked since dropping out of community college. 2 months ago, her landlord had sold the building to a development company that quadrupled the rent overnight. 1 month ago, she'd answered an ad promising housing and employment, no experience necessary, and signed papers she hadn't read carefully enough because the woman across the desk had kind eyes and spoke softly about opportunity. 2 weeks ago, they'd taken her phone. 1 week ago, they'd moved her to a windowless room with 6 other girls who wouldn't meet her eyes. Yesterday, they'd bathed her in rosewater and dressed her in white linen that felt like a shroud. Now a man's voice was calling out numbers that made her stomach turn. 20,000. 3045. The bidding had a rhythm to it, almost musical, and she focused on that instead of what it meant. Someone was buying her. Someone would own her. The paperwork they'd made her sign had been very clear about the terms of servitude, about blood rights and feeding schedules, and the relinquishment of legal personhood for the duration of the contract, which had no end date. She should have read it more carefully. She should have run. She should have done a lot of things differently. But hindsight was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. 70,000, new voice said, and the room went quiet. It wasn't loud, that voice. It didn't need to be. It carried the kind of authority that made sound itself bend around it, and even through the lights Willa could sense movement in the audience, heads turning, bodies shifting. Someone important had just entered the bidding. 70,000 to the gentleman in the back, the auctioneer said, and there was something careful in his tone now, something that hadn't been there before. Do I hear 75? Silence. 75, the auctioneer tried again. More silence, stretching out like a held breath. Sold, the auctioneer finally said, and brought his gavel down with a crack that made Willa flinch. To Lord Alaric Konstantin. They took her off the platform and through a side door into a room where a woman with a tablet checked her wrist tag against a screen and nodded. The car's waiting, she said to someone Willa couldn't see. Penthouse delivery, priority. Willa wanted to ask questions. She wanted to know who had bought her, what he looked like, what he would do to her, whether it would hurt. But her voice had stopped working somewhere around the moment she'd realized the auction was real. That this was actually happening. That she'd been sold like furniture or livestock, and no amount of trying could force words past the knot in her throat. They put her in a black car with windows tinted so dark she couldn't see out. The door locks engaged with a heavy thunk that sounded like finality. She sat in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap and tried to remember what her life had been like before, when she'd been a person with rights and choices and a future that belonged to her. It felt very far away now, like something that had happened to someone else. The drive took 40 minutes. She counted them by the digital clock on the partition between her and the driver, watching the numbers change because it was something to focus on that wasn't the fear. When the car finally stopped and the door opened, she found herself looking at a building that stretched up into the night sky like a blade, all glass and steel and modernist angles that reflected the city lights in cold geometric patterns. This way, said a man in a dark suit, and Willa followed because she didn't have a choice. Through a lobby with marble floors and minimalist furniture that probably cost more than she'd made in a year at the diner, into an elevator that opened only when the man pressed his palm to a biometric scanner. The elevator rose so smoothly she barely felt the movement, just watched the floor numbers climb on the display. 30, 40, 50, 60. It stopped at 70. The doors opened onto a private foyer with a single door at the far end, black wood inlaid with silver in patterns that might have been decorative, or might have been something older. Something with meaning she didn't understand. The man in the suit gestured her forward and stayed in the elevator. The doors closed behind her with a whisper of sound, and Willa was alone. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the door. On the other side of it was the person who owned her now. The vampire who'd paid $70,000 for the right to her blood, her body, her life. She should knock, she should announce herself. She should do something other than stand here shaking. But her feet seemed to have rooted to the floor. The door opened before she could decide. The man on the other side was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen and the most terrifying. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with white hair that fell past his shoulders in a straight cascade that caught the light like silk. His skin was pale enough to make the white linen shirt he wore look cream by comparison, and his eyes were the color of winter ice, so pale they were almost colorless. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking, his expression completely unreadable, and Willa felt pinned by that gaze like a butterfly on a collector's board. "Come in," he said finally, and stepped aside. Willa's feet moved before her brain caught up, carrying her past him into a space that redefined every concept she'd had of what an apartment could be. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city like it was a kingdom spread at their feet. The furniture was sparse but exquisite, all clean lines and dark wood and leather that looked butter-soft. Art hung on the walls, real art, the kind she'd only seen in museums. Everything was perfect, controlled, arranged with the kind of precision that spoke of either obsession or centuries of practice. The door closed behind her with a sound like a tomb ceiling. "My name is Alaric Konstantin," the vampire said, moving past her with a grace that was almost feline. "You're Willa Bennett, according to the paperwork." It was the first time anyone had used her name in 2 weeks. Hearing it in his voice, accented with something old-world and unplaceable, made her throat tight. She nodded because she still couldn't trust herself to speak. He studied her for another moment, then gestured toward a hallway. "The bedroom is this way. You should rest." Willa found her voice finally. It came out smaller than she'd intended. "What do you want from me?" Alaric's expression didn't change. "Tonight? Nothing. You've had a difficult evening. Sleep." "But I'm—" She didn't know how to finish the sentence. "Your property, your blood servant, your thing." "You're exhausted," Alaric said, cutting her off with the kind of gentleness that was somehow worse than cruelty would have been. "We can discuss the details tomorrow. For now, sleep." He led her down the hallway to a bedroom that was larger than the entire apartment she'd lost. The bed was enormous, dressed in linens so white they seemed to glow in the low light. There was a bathroom attached, all marble and chrome, with towels stacked in perfect alignment and toiletries arranged on the counter like an upscale hotel. Everything was pristine, untouched, waiting. "This is yours," Alaric said. "There are clothes in the closet. Help yourself to anything you need." Willa stared at the bed, then at him. "Where will you?" "I have other rooms," he said, and there was something in his tone that discouraged further questions. "Lock the door if it makes you feel safer." He left before she could respond, pulling the door closed behind him with a soft click. Willa stood frozen for a moment, then crossed to the door and tried the lock. It turned smoothly, the deadbolt sliding home with a solid thunk that should have made her feel secure, but instead made her feel insane. She'd been sold at auction to a vampire king, and he'd given her a bedroom with a lock that worked from the inside. Nothing about this made sense. She should have been relieved. Instead, she was terrified, because kindness was worse than cruelty. Cruelty she understood. Cruelty had rules. But this? This was something else entirely, and she had no framework for understanding it. She didn't sleep that first night. She sat on the edge of the bed and watched the door, waiting for it to open, waiting for him to change his mind and come back and remind her what she was now. But the door stayed closed, and eventually the sky outside the windows began to lighten from black to charcoal to the deep blue of early morning, and Willa realized she'd survived the night with her blood still in her veins. It didn't make her feel any better. The second night was worse, because the second night she had to face the fact that this wasn't temporary. Alaric had been polite, distant, perfectly courteous when she'd emerged from the bedroom that afternoon. He'd shown her the kitchen, told her to help herself to anything she wanted, and then disappeared into what he called his study and didn't come out for 6 hours. When he did emerge, he looked at her with those colorless eyes and asked if she needed anything. She'd said no because she didn't know what else to say. He'd nodded and returned to his study. That night she lay in the enormous bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to understand what was happening. He hadn't bitten her, hadn't touched her, hadn't made any demands at all. But she'd seen the paperwork. She was legally his blood servant, bound by a contract that gave him rights she didn't want to think about too carefully. So why wasn't he exercising those rights? What was he waiting for? Was this some kind of game designed to make her lower her guard so the reality would hurt worse when it came? The questions chased themselves in circles until she heard something that made her freeze. Movement in the hallway outside her room. Footsteps, slow and measured. They stopped outside her door. Willa held her breath, every muscle in her body tensed, waiting for the door to open. But it didn't. The footsteps moved again, and she heard a soft sound like fabric sliding against wood. Then silence. She waited 5 minutes. 10. When nothing else happened, curiosity overrode fear, and she slipped out of bed, crossed to the door, and turned the lock as quietly as she could. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She eased the door open an inch, then 2, and peered out into the hallway. Alaric was lying on the floor outside her door. Not sprawled, not collapsed. Lying there deliberately, on his back with his hands folded on his chest and his eyes closed. He'd put a pillow under his head and draped what looked like a coat over himself as a makeshift blanket. He was sleeping on the hardwood floor directly in front of her room like some kind of supernatural guard dog. Willa stared at him, her mind struggling to process the image. He'd given her his bed. He was sleeping on the floor. He was a vampire king, and he'd bought her at auction, and he was sleeping on the floor outside her room like he was the servant and she was the one who needed protecting. She closed the door very carefully and locked it again, then went back to bed and lay there in the dark, more confused than she'd ever been in her life. The next morning, she found him in the kitchen, making coffee with the kind of precision that suggested he'd been doing it for a very long time. He looked up when she entered, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Good morning," he said. Willa cleared her throat. "You slept on the floor last night." "Yes. Why?" Alaric poured coffee into 2 cups with steady hands. "The bedroom window faces east, direct sunlight at dawn. I wanted to ensure you weren't disturbed." It was a lie, or at least not the whole truth. The curtains on the bedroom window were heavy blackout drapes that didn't let through so much as a sliver of light. Willa had checked, but calling him on it felt dangerous in a way she couldn't quite articulate, so instead she said, "You didn't have to do that, I know." He held out one of the cups. "Coffee?" She took it automatically, then nearly dropped it when she tasted it. "How did you like salt in your coffee?" "I noticed yesterday." He said it like it was perfectly normal to observe and remember something so small about someone you'd only just bought. "It's an unusual preference, but not unheard of." Willa wrapped both hands around the cup and tried to steady herself. "I don't understand what's happening here." "I imagine not." Alaric leaned against the counter, his own coffee untouched. "Let me be clear then. You were sold to me under a contract that I consider both morally reprehensible and legally invalid. Blood servitude was outlawed in this territory 7 years ago under a statute I personally wrote and enacted. The fact that the practice continues in hidden markets is something I've been attempting to prosecute, with limited success. You wrote the law against it? Then why?" Willa's voice broke. She tried again. "Then why did you buy me?" Alaric's expression shifted, something almost like pain flickering across his features before the mask of control slammed back into place. "Because Castellan Marath was about to. And I've seen what he does to blood servants. I couldn't allow that." The name meant nothing to Willa, but the way Alaric said it made her skin crawl. "So you bought me to, what, save me?" "I bought you because I needed evidence." His voice was flat now, emotionless. "To prosecute the ring, I need a living witness who can name the room, the ledger, and the buyers. Someone who was there, who can testify to the details. Most servants don't survive long enough to be useful witnesses, and those who do are too traumatized to speak coherently. But you," he looked at her with those winter eyes, "you're different, you're angry. Anger is useful." Willa set the coffee down before she could throw it at him. "So this is still about using me?" "Yes," Alaric said, and at least he had the decency not to pretend otherwise. "I need your testimony. But I'm asking, not compelling, and I'm offering you a choice." "What choice?" The laugh that came out of her was bitter enough to taste. "I signed a contract. I'm your property. A contract signed under duress is void. You're not my property, Willa. You never were." He straightened, setting his own cup aside. "I'm offering you employment. A position as my witness in the case against the auction house and everyone involved. Real employment with a contract that's legal, wages that are fair, and terms you can negotiate." Willa stared at him. "You're joking." "I don't joke about labor law." There was the faintest hint of something in his voice that might have been humor, if vampires had such things. "If you agree, I need you to testify. To stand up in front of the court and the people who sold you and tell them exactly what happened. Every detail you can remember. Names, faces, the layout of the building, the paperwork they made you sign, the other girls who were there. Everything. And if I say no, then I'll arrange transport to wherever you want to go, provide enough money to get you settled, and you'll never see me again." Alaric said it like it was simple, like it didn't matter to him either way. But Willa had spent 2 years waitressing, reading people for tips, and she'd gotten good at spotting the tells. The way his hands had tightened on the counter, the almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders. This mattered to him more than he wanted to admit. "What are the terms?" she asked. "If I say yes." Something eased in his posture, so subtle she almost missed it. "You tell me. What do you need?" The question caught her off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked her what she needed and actually waited for an answer? She thought about it, really thought, letting herself imagine what safety might look like. "A real contract," she said finally. "Written down, legally binding. With my name on it as an employee, not property. Wages. Actual money, not just room and board. Market rate for expert witnesses is $75,000, paid in installments. Is that acceptable?" Willa's head spun. That was more than she'd made in the last 3 years combined. Yes, that's acceptable. What else?" 2 nights off per week, consecutive nights, not split up." "Agreed, and a lock on my door that works from the inside. One you don't have a key to." Alaric's expression shifted again. Something that might have been approval or might have been sadness. "Of course, anything else?" Willa thought about the floor outside her room, about the way he'd positioned himself between her and the door like a shield. "Why are you doing this?" "I told you, I need a witness." "No." She shook her head. "Why are you really doing this?" For a long moment he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear it. "I saw you on that platform. You were terrified, but you weren't broken. You looked out at that room full of monsters and you were angry, not defeated. And I thought," he paused, something crossing his face that she couldn't read. "I thought that anger deserved better than being bled out in Morit's basement. It wasn't a declaration of anything. It wasn't even particularly kind. But it was honest, and honesty was something Willa hadn't had in longer than she cared to remember. "Okay," she said. "I'll do it. I'll testify." Alaric nodded once, sharp and decisive. "I'll have the contracts drawn up by tonight. In the meantime, you should eat something. There's food in the refrigerator, and I can order anything you want delivered." "I can cook," Willa said, because she needed to do something with her hands. Something normal and human and familiar. "If that's allowed, this is your home for the duration of your employment. You can do whatever you like." He pushed away from the counter. "I have calls to make. The prosecution team will want to meet with you sometime this week to begin preparing your testimony. Is that acceptable?" "Yes." He left her alone in the kitchen, and Willa stood there surrounded by gleaming appliances and marble countertops and tried to process the fact that her life had just pivoted again, this time towards something that looked almost like hope. The contracts arrived that evening, delivered by a woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as Alaric's attorney and spent 2 hours going over every clause with Willa in exhaustive detail. The language was clear, the terms exactly what Alaric had promised. $75,000, paid in 3 installments, room and board provided, 2 consecutive nights off per week. Employment terminating automatically upon completion of testimony or at Willa's request, whichever came first. No blood rights, no servitude clauses, nothing that made her property. Willa signed her name at the bottom and felt something tight in her chest finally loosen. The attorney left with 1 copy, leaving the other for Willa. She held it for a long time after the woman had gone, just looking at her signature on the page. Proof that she existed again, that she was a person with rights and choices and a future that belonged to her. When Alaric emerged from his study an hour later, she was still sitting at the dining table with the contract in front of her. "Everything satisfactory?" he asked. "Yes." Willa looked up at him. "Thank you." He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the gratitude without quite accepting it. "The prosecution team wants to meet tomorrow night. They'll come here if that's more comfortable for you than going to their offices. Here is fine." "Good." He hesitated, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked almost uncertain. "I want you to know that you don't have to be afraid here. You're safe in this house. I give you my word, the word of a vampire king." Willa didn't mean it to sound bitter, but it came out that way anyway. The word of someone who understands what it's like to be powerless. Alaric's voice was soft, but there was steel underneath it. "I won't let anyone hurt you. Not Morith, not the auction house, not anyone. You have my protection for as long as you're under this roof." He meant it. Willa could hear the conviction in every syllable. It should have made her feel better. Instead, it made her feel fragile, because protection was just another word for dependence, and she'd worked too hard for too long to be dependent on anyone. But she was dependent now, whether she liked it or not. So she nodded and said, "Okay," and tried to believe him. The prosecution team arrived the next night with briefcases and recorders and serious expressions. There were 3 of them. 2 lawyers and a victim's advocate who had kind eyes and a gentle voice and asked Willa if she needed anything before they started. Water, tea, a moment to collect herself. Willa said no to all of it, because waiting would only make it harder. They asked her to start from the beginning. The ad she'd answered, the interview, the paperwork. She told them everything she could remember, forcing herself to be precise about details even when the memories made her hands shake. The woman with the kind eyes who'd lied so smoothly. The room with no windows where they'd kept her. The other girls, 6 of them, none of whom had spoken except to cry. The auction itself, the lights and the numbers and the feeling of being weighed and measured and found valuable only for what could be taken from her. Alaric sat in the corner throughout the entire interview, silent and still. Willa was intensely aware of him there, a presence like a banked fire. Every time her voice started to break, he would shift slightly, just enough for her to see him in her peripheral vision, and somehow that tiny motion was enough to steady her. The lawyers took notes. The advocate asked follow-up questions. By the time they were finished, 3 hours had passed, and Willa felt wrung out, hollowed, like she'd given away pieces of herself she couldn't get back. "You did very well," the advocate said, packing up her recorder. "I know this was difficult. You were very brave." Willa didn't feel brave. She felt exhausted and exposed and angry all over again, the same anger Alaric had seen on the auction platform. Angry that this had happened to her. Angry that it was still happening to other people. Angry that she had to relive it all in front of strangers just to have a chance at justice. After they left, Alaric appeared beside her with a glass of water and a plate of food she didn't remember him preparing. "Eat," he said. "I'm not hungry." "Eat anyway. You need your strength." It was the closest he'd come to giving her an order, and Willa bristled automatically. But when she looked up at him ready to argue, she saw something in his expression that stopped her. Concern, maybe. Or understanding. Something that made her realize he wasn't commanding her, he was taking care of her, and there was a difference even if she didn't entirely trust it yet. She ate. The food tasted like cardboard, but she forced it down anyway because he was right. She did need her strength. "How long until the trial?" she asked when the plate was empty. 6 weeks if everything proceeds on schedule. The prosecution is fast-tracking it. Alaric settled into the chair across from her, moving with that impossible grace that made him look like he was floating. "There will be more interviews, preparation sessions. They'll want you to go over your testimony multiple times to ensure consistency. I'll tell the same story every time. It's not like I can forget, I know." His voice was quiet. "But the defense will try to discredit you regardless. They'll question your memory, your motives, your character. You need to be prepared for that." Willa's stomach turned. "They're going to make me the villain. They're going to try. We won't let them succeed." The certainty in his voice should have been reassuring. Instead, it reminded her that he was powerful in ways she couldn't fully comprehend, that he moved in circles where courts and laws and justice were things that could be shaped by will and influence. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked. "You said you needed a witness, but there are easier ways to gather evidence. You could have raided the auction house, seized the records, arrested everyone involved. Why go through all this?" Alaric was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at something past her, something only he could see. 300 years ago, I was turned against my will," he said. "Taken from my home, from my family, from everything I knew. The vampire who made me kept me for 50 years as a curiosity, a pet. I had no rights, no voice, no autonomy. I was property in every way that mattered." His hands, resting on the table, had curled into fists. "When I finally escaped and built enough power to make changes, I swore I would never allow that to happen to anyone else under my governance. Blood servitude is an abomination. It's slavery dressed in legal language, and I will not tolerate it." Willa stared at him. It was the most she'd heard him say at once, and every word landed like a stone. "I'm sorry that happened to you. Don't be sorry, be angry." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were ice cold and burning at the same time. "Anger is what changes things. Your anger, my anger, the anger of every person who's been used and discarded and told they don't matter. That's what we're going to use to destroy this entire network." Something fierce rose up in Willa's chest, hot and sharp and almost painful. "Good." The corner of Alaric's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we start preparing in earnest." She should have gone to bed. Instead, she stayed at the table, watching him as he rose and moved toward his study. "Alaric?" He paused, glancing back. "Thank you for telling me that. About your past." He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging without quite accepting, the way he always did. Then he was gone, and Willa was alone with the weight of his story and the growing realization that maybe she wasn't the only one who needed saving. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that was almost normal. Willa met with the prosecution team 3 times a week, going over her testimony until she could recite it in her sleep. She learned the names of the other buyers at the auction, the ones who'd bid on her and the ones who'd bought other girls. She learned about the ledger, a physical book kept in a vault beneath the auction house, where every transaction was recorded in meticulous detail. She learned that the auction she'd been part of was one of dozens, that the network stretched across 3 states and had been operating for at least a decade. The scope of it made her sick. But it also made her determined. Every time she wanted to quit, to walk away and pretend none of this had happened, she thought about the other girls in that windowless room. The ones who hadn't been bought by someone who gave them contracts and locked doors. The ones who were still out there, still bleeding, still property. She would do this for them, if not for herself. Alaric was a constant presence, always nearby but never intrusive. He worked from his study most nights, dealing with whatever business vampire kings dealt with. Sometimes Willa would hear him on the phone, speaking in languages she didn't recognize, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made it clear he was used to being obeyed. Other times the penthouse was silent except for the faint sound of pages turning as he read books that looked older than countries. He never asked her for blood, never suggested it, never even looked at her like she was food. It should have been a relief, but instead it became another mystery to add to the growing collection. What did he feed on if not her? Where did he go on the nights he left the penthouse dressed in dark suits that made him look like death incarnate? Who was he really beneath the careful courtesy and the ice-cold control? She didn't ask. Asking felt dangerous, like it would obligate her to share things in return, and she wasn't ready for that kind of intimacy even if it was just conversational. But she noticed things, small things. The way he moved furniture when he thought she wasn't paying attention, shifting the couch 6 inches to the left so she'd have a clearer path to the door. The way he always positioned himself between her and whoever came into the penthouse, his body a shield she hadn't asked for but apparently needed. The way he'd started keeping the foods she liked stocked in the kitchen. Good bread, sharp cheese, the imported salt she preferred for her coffee. He was taking care of her in 100 tiny ways that added up to something bigger than the sum of their parts. And Willa didn't know what to do with that, so she did nothing. She accepted his care the way she accepted the locked door and the contract and the promise of protection, as things she needed even if they frightened her. 4 weeks into her employment, the prosecution team told her they'd found the ledger. "It was exactly where you said it would be," one of the lawyers said, spreading photographs across the table. "Vault beneath the auction house, 3rd room on the left. The detail in your testimony was perfect." Willa looked at the images and felt her stomach drop. There it was, the book she'd only glimpsed once when they'd brought her into the building. Leather-bound, thick, the pages covered in neat handwriting that reduced human lives to line items and prices. "There's something else," the advocate said gently. "Something we need to tell you before you hear it elsewhere." Willa's hands went cold. "What?" "One of the names in the ledger." The woman paused, choosing her words carefully. "It's someone in Lord Konstantin's household." The room tilted. Willa gripped the edge of the table. "Who?" "His steward, a vampire named Severin who's been in his service for 6 centuries. The lawyer pulled out another photograph, this one showing a page from the ledger. There in that same neat handwriting was a name she didn't recognize next to a series of transactions that made her skin crawl. "He's been buying servants for decades, at least 40 that we can confirm. Most of them are dead now." Willa's mind went blank, then filled with white noise. Alaric's steward, someone he'd trusted for 600 years. Someone who'd been under his roof, part of his household, all while running a piece of the very network Alaric was trying to destroy. "Does he know?" she asked. "We told him an hour ago." The advocate's voice was soft. "He's handling it personally." Willa stood up so fast her chair fell over. "Where is he, Miss Bennett?" "I don't think." But Willa was already moving out of the dining room and down the hallway to Alaric's study. The door was closed but not locked. She pushed it open without knocking. Alaric was standing by the window, his back to her, one hand pressed against the glass like he was holding himself up. The study was dark except for the city lights beyond the window, and in that dimness he looked carved from marble, utterly still. "Alaric," Willa said. He didn't turn. "You should go back to your meeting. They told me about Severin." "Yes, I imagine they did. Are you okay?" That made him turn finally. His expression was blank, but his eyes were glacial, colder than she'd ever seen them. "Am I okay? That's what you wanted to know?" "Yes," Willa said, because it was the truth. Alaric laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "My steward of 6 centuries has been trafficking humans under my nose for decades. He's used my household, my resources, my trust to facilitate slavery. 40 people are dead because I didn't see what was happening in my own home. So no, Willa, I'm not okay." The rawness in his voice cut her. She'd seen him controlled, careful, composed. She'd never seen him like this, with the mask stripped away and the fury underneath laid bare. "It's not your fault," she said, "isn't it?" He moved toward her, not threatening but intense, like a storm building. "I'm responsible for everyone in my household. I should have known. I should have seen the signs. He lied to you for 600 years. That's not your failure, that's his. The distinction doesn't matter to the people he killed." Willa wanted to argue, to find words that would make this better, but she'd never been good at comfort. She'd spent too long keeping her own pain locked down to know how to help someone else with theirs, so instead she did the only thing she could think of. She stepped forward and took his hand. Alaric froze. His hand was cold under hers, inhumanly so, but it didn't feel dead. It felt like ice before it melted, like potential energy waiting to be released. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I don't know," Willa admitted, "but you looked like you needed someone to hold on to. And I'm here." For a moment he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then something in him seemed to break, and he turned his hand over and gripped hers so tightly it almost hurt. They stood like that for a long time, hand in hand in the dark study, while the city lights flickered beyond the window and the weight of betrayal hung in the air between them. Willa didn't know how to make this better, but she could stand here with him, and maybe that was enough. Eventually Alaric spoke, his voice quiet again. "I'm going to handle this myself. Severin will face trial along with the others, but the immediate consequences will be mine to administer." Willa understood what he wasn't saying. Whatever happened to Severin would happen tonight, in private, without ceremony or mercy. "Do you need me to leave?" "No." His grip tightened fractionally. "No, stay." So she stayed. And when he finally let go of her hand and left the study with his shoulders set and his expression carved from ice, she went back to her meeting and told the prosecution team that Lord Konstantin was handling the situation. She didn't see Alaric for 3 days after that. The penthouse felt empty without him, even though Willa had spent plenty of time alone there before. She went through the motions of her preparation sessions, ate the meals that appeared in the refrigerator as if by magic, slept in the bed he'd given her. But the silence was oppressive, and she found herself listening for the sound of his footsteps, the low murmur of his voice on the phone, any sign that he'd come back. On the third night, she woke to the sound of the front door opening. She was out of bed and in the hallway before she'd fully decided to move, her heart hammering. Alaric stood in the foyer, still in the dark suit he'd left wearing, and he looked like death. Not undead, not vampire, just exhausted in a way that went bone deep. "You're back," Willa said, because she needed to say something. "I'm back." His voice was flat, empty. "Is it done?" "It's done." He moved past her toward his study, and Willa followed without asking permission. When he sank into the chair behind his desk, she perched on the edge of the couch and waited. "He didn't deny it," Alaric said after a long silence. "When I confronted him with the evidence, he didn't even try to lie. He said it was business, that the laws had changed but the opportunities hadn't, that he was simply adapting to market conditions." His hands were shaking. Willa had never seen him shake before. 600 years. I trusted him for 600 years. And he spoke about murdering humans like it was a quarterly earnings report. "What did you do?" "What I had to." Alaric looked at her, and his eyes were haunted. "He's gone. Permanently. The council will be informed, the prosecutors will be notified. There will be paperwork." Willa knew she should probably ask more questions, demand details, understand exactly what gone meant. But she found she didn't want to know. Whatever Alaric had done, he'd done it for the right reasons, and that was enough. "I'm sorry you had to do that alone," she said instead. "I wasn't alone. You were here when I came back." He said it like it mattered, like her presence in the penthouse was something more than just the fulfillment of a contract. That helped. Something warm unfurled in Willa's chest, and she immediately tried to squash it. This was employment, not friendship, protection, not affection. She couldn't afford to confuse the two. But when Alaric stood and moved to the window, staring out at the city like he was looking for answers in the lights, she found herself standing too and crossing to join him. "You should rest," she said. "I don't sleep much. You sleep on the floor outside my door every night." He glanced at her, something almost like surprise crossing his face. "You knew about that?" "I've known since the second night. You're not as subtle as you think." "I didn't want you to be alone," he said quietly. "Not after what you'd been through. And the bedroom door, it's solid, but it's not reinforced. If someone tried to get in, I wanted to be there to stop them." Willa's throat went tight. "No one's tried to get in." "No, but they might. Morath knows I bought you. He knows you're going to testify. He has resources, connections. I won't risk your safety for the sake of my comfort. So you've been sleeping on the floor for a month to keep me safe." Yes. It was the most quietly heroic thing anyone had ever done for her, and Willa had absolutely no idea how to respond. So she said the only thing she could think of, "Thank you." Alaric inclined his head in that way he had, acknowledging without quite accepting. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it transformed his face from austere to something almost gentle. "You're welcome." They stood there together, looking out at the city, and Willa felt something shift between them. A softening, a lowering of guards. She still didn't fully trust him, might never fully trust anyone again. But she was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was exactly who he appeared to be. Someone trying to do the right thing in a world that made righteousness complicated. The trial date arrived 6 weeks to the day after Willa had signed her contract. She dressed in the clothes the prosecution team had selected for her, conservative and professional, and tried not to throw up from nerves. Alaric appeared in her doorway as she was attempting to fix her hair for the third time. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the brush in her hand. Willa handed it over, too anxious to question why a vampire king would know how to style hair. He worked in silence, his movements gentle and efficient, and when he was done her hair was pinned in a neat twist that made her look older, more credible. "There," he said. "Perfect. I don't feel perfect. I feel like I'm going to pass out. That's normal. But you won't pass out. You're stronger than you think." He set the brush down and met her eyes in the mirror. "I'll be there the entire time. Front row. If you need a moment, just look at me and we'll take a recess." "You can do that? Just call a recess?" "I'm the vampire king. I can do whatever I want." He said it with a straight face, but there was a glint of something in his eyes that might have been humor. "Within reason. And for you, I'd push those boundaries." The warmth in Willa's chest flared again, stronger this time. She turned to face him, needing to see his expression directly instead of in reflection. "Why are you doing all this? And don't say it's because you need a witness. This is more than that." Alaric was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft. "I saw you on that platform and I thought you deserved better. I still think that. Every day I think that. And somewhere along the way, making sure you got better became the most important thing in my life. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even a confession of affection. But it was honest and raw and more than Willa had expected, and she didn't know what to do with the feelings it stirred up. "I'm going to testify," she said, because she needed to focus on something concrete. "I'm going to tell them everything, and we're going to destroy this network. For the girls who didn't make it out. For the ones who are still trapped. For all of us." "Yes," Alaric said. "You are." The courtroom was nothing like Willa had imagined. She'd pictured something from a TV show, all wood paneling and formal drama. Instead, it was a sleek modern space with clean lines and uncomfortable chairs, and it was packed. Vampires filled the gallery, all of them white-haired and pale and beautiful and terrifying. At the defendant's table sat 5 people she recognized from the auction. The auctioneer, the woman with kind eyes who'd recruited her, and 3 buyers whose faces were seared into her memory. Morith was there too, in the front row of the gallery, watching her with eyes that promised violence. Willa's hands started shaking. She forced them still. Alaric was exactly where he'd said he'd be, front row on the opposite side of the room from Morith. He caught her eye and nodded once, and that tiny acknowledgement was enough to steady her. The prosecution called her to the stand. She walked up with her head high, sat down, and swore to tell the truth. Then she began to speak. She told them everything. The ad, the interview, the paperwork, the windowless room and the other girls in the rosewater bath. The auction itself, standing on the platform while people bid on her like she was livestock. The fear and the anger in the moment when she'd realized her life as she'd known it was over. She named names, pointed to faces, described the ledger in detail, the vault where it had been kept, the neat handwriting that had recorded transactions in blood. She talked about the girls she'd seen, the ones who'd been too scared to speak, the ones who'd been bought by people whose eyes held nothing but hunger and cruelty. The defense attorney tried to discredit her, just like Alaric had warned. Questioned her memory, suggested she'd been coached, implied she had financial motives for lying. Willa answered every question with calm precision, refusing to be rattled. When the attorney suggested she'd gone to the auction willingly, seeking employment she'd understood, Willa looked him dead in the eye and said, "I answered an ad for a receptionist. I was sold as property. If you can't see the difference, that says more about you than it does about me." A ripple went through the gallery. The defense attorney sat down. The prosecution called more witnesses, other survivors, freed from various buyers when the ledger had been seized, experts who testified about the psychological impact of trafficking, financial analysts who traced the money through shell companies and offshore accounts. The case built like a wall, each piece of evidence another brick. Until the structure was undeniable, the defense had nothing. They tried, calling character witnesses for the defendants and experts who questioned the chain of custody for the ledger. But it was transparent desperation, and the court saw through it. After 3 days of testimony, the judge called for deliberation. It took the counsel jury 40 minutes to return a verdict, guilty, on all counts. For all defendants, the sentencing was swift and brutal. The auction house operators got life imprisonment in the council's deepest cells. The buyers got varying terms based on the severity of their crimes. And Morith, who'd been implicated through the ledger and testimony from other survivors, got 50 years in isolation. It wasn't enough. Nothing would have been enough. But it was justice, and for the moment, that had to be enough. Willa walked out of the courthouse with her head high and Alaric at her side, and for the first time in months she felt like she could breathe. "It's over," she said. "The trial is over." Alaric agreed. "The work continues, but yes, this part is over." They'd made it to the car when Willa realized she was crying. Not sad tears, not scared tears, relief tears, the kind that came when something you'd been carrying for so long finally got set down. Alaric handed her a handkerchief without comment. She took it and pressed it to her face, trying to compose herself. "I did it," she said into the fabric. "You did it," Alaric confirmed. "You were extraordinary. What happens now?" "Now you decide what you want to happen. Your contract is fulfilled. You're free to go wherever you'd like, do whatever you'd like. The compensation will be transferred to your account within 24 hours. He said it evenly, but Willa had learned to read him over the past weeks. She could hear the tension underneath, the careful neutrality that meant he was bracing for something. She lowered the handkerchief and looked at him. "What if I don't want to go?" Something flickered in his expression, too fast to read. "Then you stay, in whatever capacity you choose. I want to keep working on this. There are still people out there, still servants being held. The auction house is shut down, but the network is bigger than that." The words spilled out of her, urgent and certain. "I want to help free them. I want to make sure they get the same chance I got." Alaric studied her for a long moment. "That would be dangerous. The people we arrested have allies, enemies of mine who won't take this lying down. If you continue working on this, you'll be a target." "I'm already a target." Morith looked at me like he wanted to rip my throat out. "He did. He does. Which is why you should consider accepting the settlement and starting over somewhere safe." Willa shook her head. "I don't want safe. I want useful. I want to matter. This work matters. Yes, Alaric said quietly. It does, so I'm staying, if you'll have me. He broke off, something almost like laughter escaping him. Willa, I've been trying to think of ways to convince you to stay since the day you signed that contract. If I'll have you, yes, absolutely yes. The warmth in Willa's chest became a fire, bright and consuming. What would I do? What's my role? Whatever you want it to be. I could use someone who understands the human perspective, who can advocate for the survivors and help design the support systems they need. The council created a restitution fund from the defendants' seized assets. Someone needs to administrate it, make sure the money goes where it's needed. He paused. Or you could do something else entirely. The choice is yours. Willa thought about the girls in the windowless room, about the other survivors she'd met during the trial, about everyone still trapped in the network. I want to run the restitution fund, and I want to help find the people who are still being held, and I want to turn that auction house into something useful, something that helps instead of hurts. Then that's what we'll do. Alaric said it like it was simple, like reshaping the world to match her vision was just a matter of logistics. Maybe for him it was. They drove back the penthouse in comfortable silence, and when they arrived, Willa realized she was thinking of it as home now, not as a temporary sanctuary. The locked door, the kitchen where she'd learned to cook with good ingredients, the windows that looked out over the city like a promise. This was hers now if she wanted it. Alaric, she said as they stepped into the foyer. He turned, raising an eyebrow. I need to know something. You said you saw me on the auction platform and thought I deserved better. When did that become? She struggled for the right words. When did I become the most important thing? He could have deflected, could have given her another carefully neutral answer. Instead, he looked at her with those winter eyes and said, the moment I saw you. I've been trying to convince myself otherwise ever since, but I'm not particularly good at lying to myself. Willa's breath caught. That was 2 months ago. Yes, you've been in love with me for 2 months and you slept on the floor and never said anything. You'd been sold into slavery. The last thing you needed was the person protecting you making romantic overtures. That would have been an abuse of power. He said it like it was obvious, like it hadn't cost him anything to keep silent. But Willa could see the truth in the set of his shoulders, the carefully controlled distance he kept between them even now. It had cost him everything, and he'd paid it gladly, because her safety and autonomy mattered more than his feelings. Something inside Willa's chest cracked open. What if I wanted you to make romantic overtures? Alaric went very still. Willa, I'm not your employee anymore. The contract is fulfilled. We're on equal footing now, as equal as a human and a vampire king can be. She stepped toward him, closing the distance he'd so carefully maintained. So I'm asking, not as someone you saved, as someone who wants to know. Know what? If you still think I deserve better, or if maybe you've realized you could be what better looks like. For a moment he just stared at her. Then he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face with one cold hand. I will never be worthy of you, he said, his voice rough. But if you'll have me, I will spend every day trying to be. Willa leaned into his touch. I'll have you, if you'll stop sleeping on the floor. That startled a laugh out of him, real and unguarded. Willa Bennett, are you inviting me to share your bed? It's your bed. You just let me borrow it. It's yours. Everything here is yours if you want it. His thumb traced her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. Including me. Willa rose up on her toes and kissed him. He tasted like winter and something darker, something that should have been frightening but instead felt like coming home. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and for the first time since the auction, Willa felt safe not because someone was protecting her, but because she'd chosen to trust someone who'd earned it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alaric pressed his forehead to hers. I need to ask you something, he said. Okay, would you consider turning? Eventually, I mean. Not now. Not for years, if that's what you want. But someday. His voice was careful, like he was afraid of the answer. I'm immortal, you're not. I don't know how to reconcile that. Willa had thought about this late at night when she couldn't sleep. Thought about what it would mean to give up her humanity, to become something other. It should have terrified her. Maybe it would have before. But now, after everything, the idea of forever didn't seem frightening. It seemed like possibility. Ask me again after we've freed everyone we can find, she said. After we've turned the auction house into something good, after I've done the work I need to do as a human, then I'll give you an answer. That could take years, I know. Is that a problem? No. Alaric kissed her again, soft and sweet. I'm immortal, remember? I can wait. The months that followed were a blur of work and purpose. Willa threw herself into administrating the restitution fund, making sure every survivor got the support they needed. Housing, therapy, job training, whatever it took to rebuild their lives. She worked with the council to establish new laws, stronger protections, harsher penalties for anyone caught trafficking. She gave interviews, wrote editorials, became a voice for people who'd been silenced, and she fell in love. It happened gradually, in small moments that accumulated like interest. Alaric bringing her coffee with salt already added. The way he listened when she talked about her plans for the auction house, asking questions that helped her think through problems. The night he taught her to dance in the living room because she'd mentioned once that she'd never learned. The way he held her when she had nightmares about the auction, his presence solid and real and safe. He never pushed, never demanded. Just loved her with a quiet constancy that made her believe in futures she'd thought were lost. A year after the trial, the auction house reopened as a refuge and training center for trafficking survivors. Willa stood in the main hall, the same room where she'd been sold, and looked at the changes they'd made. The platform was gone, replaced by comfortable furniture and bright lights. The walls were painted warm colors. There were classrooms, counseling offices, a kitchen that smelled like fresh bread. Dozens of people filled the space, survivors and supporters and council members who'd come for the opening ceremony. Alaric stood beside Willa on what had once been the auction floor, his hand warm in hers. "You did this," he said quietly. "We did this," Willa corrected. The director of the new center, a survivor named Maria who'd testified alongside Willa, stepped up to the microphone. She spoke about second chances and the power of community, about turning pain into purpose. When she finished, she looked at Willa. "We have one more thing to do tonight," Maria said. "Willa, would you come up here?" Willa glanced at Alaric, who looked suspiciously innocent. She made her way to the front. Suspicious and confused, Maria held out a set of keys. "These are the keys to this building. They belong to the survivors, not to the council, not to any authority. We decide what happens here, we make the rules. And we wanted you to be the one to officially open the doors because you're the reason any of us are here at all." Willa took the keys with shaking hands. She looked out at the crowd, at faces she recognized from the trial and faces she'd met in the months since. People who'd been property and now were human again, who'd been voiceless and now spoke with authority. "I don't have a speech prepared," she admitted. "But I can tell you this, what happened to us was theft. They stole our choices, our autonomy, our lives, and we're taking it all back. This building used to be where people were bought and sold. Now it's where we learn and grow and build futures they told us we couldn't have. That's not just justice, that's victory." The applause was deafening. After the ceremony, after the last guests had left and the building was quiet, Willa and Alaric stood alone in the main hall. She still held the keys, turning them over in her hands. "I have an answer for you," she said. Alaric went very still. "An answer? You asked me if I'd consider turning. I've done the work I needed to do as a human. I've helped build something that will continue without me. I've made a difference." She looked up at him. "So yes, I want to turn. I want forever with you." The expression on Alaric's face was worth every moment of uncertainty, every fear, every doubt. Pure joy, unguarded and overwhelming. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Once it's done, there's no going back. I'm certain. I want this. I want you. I want the time to do more work, help more people, make more changes, and I want to do it with you beside me." Alaric pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "When? Tonight. Right now. In this building, where I was sold and where I learned to be free again. I want to become something new in the place where the old me died. Then tonight it is." He pulled back enough to meet her eyes. "I love you. I need you to know that before we do this. I love you more than I thought I was capable of loving anything." "I love you too," Willa said, and meant it with every part of herself. "Now bite me, Vampire King." He laughed, bright and free, and then he did. The turning was pain and ecstasy and transformation all at once. Willa felt her humanity drain away and something else rush in to fill the space. Something cold and powerful and eternal. When it was over, she opened eyes that saw the world in sharper detail, heard Alaric's voice with crystal clarity when he asked if she was all right. "I'm perfect," she said, and her voice sounded different, richer. "I'm free." They left the building hand in hand and drove back to the penthouse as dawn approached. Willa watched the sky lighten with new eyes, knowing it would be her last sunrise for a while. She wasn't sad, she was ready. "What happens now?" she asked as they stepped into the elevator. "Now you learn to be vampire. I'll teach you everything you need to know." Alaric pulled her close. "And then we continue the work. The council has agreed to make you voice for mortal labor, official position. You'll have the authority to investigate complaints, draft legislation, represent human interests in council proceedings. They're giving a newly turned vampire that kind of power. They're giving the woman who destroyed a trafficking network and turned an auction house into a refuge that kind of power. The fact that you're vampire now just means you'll have centuries to use it." He kissed her temple. "You're going to change the world, Willa, and I'm going to help you do it." The elevator reached the penthouse. They stepped out into the foyer, and Willa looked around at the space that had been her sanctuary, her home, her launching point for revolution. The windows were already darkening automatically, blocking out the rising sun. She had time before she needed to sleep. I want to make new contracts, she said. For the refuge center, real employment agreements for everyone who works there, with wages and benefits and protections. I want them to be the model for how all mortal vampire employment should work. Then we'll make them, Alaric said. Tonight, after you've rested. I'm not tired, you will be. Turning takes a lot of energy, you should sleep. Willa looked at the hallway that led to the bedroom, the one he'd given her that first night. Will you sleep with me? In the bed, I mean. Not on the floor. Yes, Alaric said. I'll sleep with you. In the bed, not on the floor. They went to the bedroom together, and Willa changed into comfortable clothes while Alaric drew the blackout curtains completely closed. When she climbed into bed, he joined her, pulling her against his chest with careful reverence. Thank you, Willa said into the darkness. For what? For seeing me on that platform and deciding I deserved better. For giving me your bed and sleeping on the floor. For protecting me and employing me and loving me, for all of it. Alaric's arms tightened around her. You deserved all of that and more, you always will. Willa closed her eyes and let sleep pull her under, safe in the knowledge that when she woke she'd have eternity to keep fighting, keep building, keep making the world better. And she'd have Alaric beside her every step of the way, partner and protector and love of her very long life. The end came gently, as all good endings should. But it wasn't really an ending at all. It was a beginning, the start of forever. And Willa Bennett faced it the same way she'd faced everything else. With anger transmuted into purpose, fear transformed into strength, and love that had grown from the most unlikely soil into something that would outlast centuries, she'd been sold to a vampire king as a blood servant. He'd given her his bed and slept on the floor, and in doing so he'd given her back herself. Everything that came after was just details, beautiful, world-changing, revolutionary details.